Imagine being the daughter of one of the richest CEOs in the city, living in a mansion filled with balloons, flowers, and the biggest birthday cake you've ever seen. But when the candles are lit, no one shows up. No friends. No laughter. Just silence. And then a driver's little girl walks in and changes everything. The candles flickered on a large, beautifully decorated birthday cake. 12 candles, carefully placed by the house staff, stood tall on top of layers of vanilla and chocolate. They were shaped like tiny stars, glowing softly in the dim golden light of the chandelier above. The frosting shimmered, sprinkled with edible glitter, as though it had been designed for a royal banquet. Balloons floated gently, tied to every chair and corner of the grand dining hall. They were bright, colorful, and expensive, each one custom printed with the words "Happy Birthday, Ella." Expensive flower arrangements sat in crystal vases, their petals perfect, their fragrance filling the air. Golden ribbons lined the walls, and shimmering lights twinkled like fairy dust. But despite all this beauty, the space felt heavy, cold, empty. At the center of the long polished oak table sat Ella, a sweet little girl in a wheelchair. Her hair was neatly brushed into soft curls, with a little pink bow clipped to the side. She wore a lovely birthday dress her father had picked out, silky light blue, with lace around the collar. A small party hat tilted awkwardly on her head, slightly too big for her small frame. She was only 10 years old, and yet her eyes carried a sadness that no child should ever know. Ella was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city, Mr. Richard Hayes, a powerful CEO whose face appeared in magazines and newspapers almost every week. He was respected, feared, and admired. People looked at his company's skyscrapers and saw success. They looked at his cars, his mansion, and his tailored suits and saw power. But inside this grand mansion, all the glitter faded. Because here sat Ella, his greatest treasure, alone. It was her birthday, a day that should have been filled with giggles, songs, and the sound of children running through hallways. A day of games, frosting-covered smiles, and torn wrapping paper. Yet no friends had come. Not because she hadn't invited anyone. In fact, she had. A week before, Ella had carefully written out invitations with her tiny hands, her handwriting shaky but full of hope. She had asked the house staff to deliver them to her classmates at school. She dreamed of balloons, laughter, and everyone singing happy birthday just for her. But the responses never came. Most of her classmates avoided her. They didn't understand her disability. Some kids teased her behind her back. Others whispered cruel words she could still hear in her head. She's weird. She can't play like us. She's different. Their parents weren't much better. Many smiled politely in front of Mr. Hayes, but whispered when they thought no one was listening. Poor thing, she's not like the others. It must be hard. Best not to mix our kids too much. And so one by one, her classmates stayed away. Now, the grand dining hall stood as proof of her isolation. A room built for dozens of guests was reduced to just one small girl, and a cake too large for her to ever finish. Ella stared at the cake. It was beautiful, but instead of feeling joy, she felt a sting in her chest. She picked up the knife that had been placed beside her and thought of what it would feel like to cut it. Usually, cutting a cake was the best part of a birthday. Everyone leaned forward, clapping and cheering. Hands reached for plates. Voices shouted her name. But tonight, if she cut the cake, the sound that would follow would only be silence. The big mansion echoed with it. Every tick of the golden clock on the wall sounded louder. Every creak of the wooden floor reminded her of how alone she was. She tried to smile. After all, it was her special day. She wanted to believe that birthdays were always happy. But as she glanced at the dozens of empty chairs surrounding the table, her smile broke. Her small hands trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. Her heart whispered the truth she had tried to hide from herself all day. She was forgotten. Forgotten by her classmates. Forgotten by the children she once tried to befriend. Forgotten by the world outside the tall gates of her father's mansion. Her father had promised he would make her birthday special. And yes, the decorations were beautiful. The cake was expensive. The lights sparkled. But what good were ribbons and balloons when there were no friends to share them with? A single tear slid down her cheek. She quickly wiped it with the back of her hand, embarrassed, even though no one was there to see. She whispered softly to herself, "Happy birthday, Ella." Her own voice echoed back to her in the vast, empty room, sounding so small, so fragile, as if even the walls felt sorry for her. Her gaze wandered to the window, where she could see the city lights glowing in the distance. Somewhere out there, other children were laughing, playing, celebrating. Somewhere, someone else's birthday was filled with joy, but not hers. For a moment, she wished she wasn't who she was, the CEO's daughter, living in a mansion, surrounded by wealth. For a moment, she wished she could just be an ordinary little girl, sitting cross-legged on the floor with friends, playing silly games, eating messy cupcakes, and laughing until her belly hurt. Instead, she sat in silence, her small frame swallowed by the enormous chair, her wheelchair wheels glinting under the chandelier's light. The birthday candles flickered again, casting shadows across her face. They seemed to dance almost mockingly, as though asking, "What's the point of a wish, when no one is here to celebrate with you?" Ella closed her eyes tightly, as though trying to shut out the sadness. She made a wish anyway. She didn't wish for toys. She didn't wish for dresses or dolls. She wished for something simple. She wished for anyone, who would sit beside her. Someone who wouldn't see her as different, but as Ella. Just Ella. Her little heart clung to that wish, as the tears kept falling. And though she didn't know it yet, that wish was about to come true in the most unexpected way. From the corner of the room, Richard Hayes stood watching. He wasn't just any man. He was one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. His days were usually filled with boardrooms, contracts, stock prices, and headlines. Men of his stature were rarely shaken by anything. They commanded rooms, decided the future of companies, and carried themselves with unshakable confidence. But today, in his own home, in front of his own daughter, Richard felt powerless. The room looked stunning. The staff had followed every instruction. The decorations sparkled, the cake gleamed under the chandelier, and the air smelled faintly of roses and vanilla frosting. Yet none of it mattered, because in the middle of all this luxury sat his daughter, small, fragile, and heartbreakingly alone. Richard's chest tightened. Ella had everything money could buy. He had spared no expense over the years. She had private tutors, the best nurses to help with her medical needs, the finest toys from across the world, and closets filled with dresses from top designers. Her room upstairs looked like a princess's palace, painted ceilings, shelves of books, a custom dollhouse bigger than most apartments. But tonight, all of it seemed meaningless. Because in that quiet moment, Richard realized there was one thing his daughter did not have. Something money, influence, and power couldn't secure. Friends. Real friends who cared for her. It struck him harder than any corporate loss ever had. He had fought billion-dollar battles in his career and won. But here, with his daughter, he was losing the most important fight of all. The fight against her loneliness. He swallowed hard, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He thought back to all the times he had come home late, briefcase in hand, loosening his tie as he walked past Ella's door. Sometimes he would peek in and see her asleep, her small hands curled around a stuffed bear. Other times he saw her awake, sitting by her window, looking out at the city lights. She had always looked so quiet, so patient. And every time he had told himself, "She's fine. She has everything she needs. I'll make it up to her later." But later never came. Now, watching her sit alone in front of a cake too big for a single child, Richard realized how wrong he had been. His little girl didn't need more toys. She didn't need more dresses. She didn't even need this enormous mansion. What she needed was laughter echoing off the walls. What she needed was the sound of children singing her name, the warmth of tiny hands clapping for her, the joy of sharing a slice of cake with someone her own age. She needed love that couldn't be bought. Richard's throat tightened as he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He moved slowly, as though unsure if he even deserved to interrupt her silence. When he finally reached her side, he forced a smile. He wanted to be strong for her, but inside, he felt like a man unraveling. He bent slightly, his tall figure casting a shadow over the little girl in her wheelchair. His voice softened, losing all the authority it usually carried. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said gently. "Shall we cut the cake?" Ella looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, full of both hope and sadness. For a moment, she gave him a small smile, the kind of smile children give when they're trying to protect someone else's feelings. She didn't want to disappoint her father, but her brave little mask cracked, and she whispered something that pierced Richard's soul. "It doesn't feel like a birthday when you're all alone, Daddy." The words were soft, almost fragile, yet they hit him harder than any insult, harder than any loss he had faced in his ruthless world of business. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was like being struck by lightning. In all his life, he had closed million-dollar deals, outsmarted competitors, and stood against powerful men without flinching. But his 10-year-old daughter's words, they broke him. He felt a sharp ache in his chest, like a knife twisting. Richard had always prided himself on being in control. If there was a problem, he solved it. If there was a weakness, he turned it into strength. But this was different. He couldn't fix her loneliness with a phone call. He couldn't sign a contract and make her happy. He couldn't order his employees to fill her world with genuine love. And for the first time in years, the mighty CEO wished he could trade every last dollar he owned, every skyscraper, every luxury car, every headline with his name, for something so simple. A room full of children singing happy birthday to his daughter. He imagined the sound. He imagined Ella's eyes lighting up as friends surrounded her, cheering and clapping. He imagined her blowing out the candles while kids laughed and reached for slices of cake. The image tore at him, because it was the one gift he hadn't given her. He had given her the world, but not what she truly needed. His hands clenched slightly as he looked at her. He wanted to promise her the world right there, to tell her things would change, that he'd make it better. But he couldn't find the words. His throat burned. So instead, he simply knelt down beside her chair, placing his hand gently on hers. Ella leaned her head slightly, resting it against his arm. Her small gesture spoke volumes. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his speeches. She just needed him, her father, present, real, and here with her. And in that moment, Richard Hayes, the man who had spent his life building empires, realized that his greatest failure had nothing to do with business. It was failing to notice how lonely his daughter had been all these years. And his greatest challenge wasn't out there in the boardrooms. It was right here in this quiet dining hall, with a little girl who just wanted to be seen, loved, and celebrated like any other child. Just then, as Richard stood beside his daughter in the silence of the grand dining hall, a sound broke through the heavy stillness. It wasn't the ticking of the golden clock or the soft hiss of the candles. It was something different voices. Richard straightened, his head turning toward the doorway. There, standing quietly, was Marcus, the new driver he had only recently hired. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a clean white shirt and dark trousers. His posture was humble, respectful, but his face carried a warmth that immediately softened the air around him. And beside him stood a little girl, his daughter. She was around Ella's age, with curly hair tied into two playful puffs, wearing a simple yellow dress that seemed almost too small for such a big personality. She clutched Marcus's hand tightly, but her wide eyes sparkled as she took in the sight of the balloons, the cake, and Ella sitting at the table. Richard blinked, surprised. He had not expected anyone from his staff to intrude on such a personal evening. His instinct as a CEO was to guard his private life fiercely. Employees were employees. Work was work. Family was family. Those lines were never crossed. But before he could say anything, Marcus spoke softly. "Sir," he said with quiet respect, "I couldn't help noticing the decorations. Is it Ella's birthday?" His tone carried no intrusion, no arrogance, just simple kindness. Richard hesitated. For a man who could command rooms full of investors, this simple question suddenly made him feel exposed. He cleared his throat, embarrassed to admit the truth. "Yes," he said slowly, "but it's just us." His words hung heavily in the air. He didn't mean for them to sound so hollow, but they did. And the way Marcus's eyes flickered, briefly full of sympathy, made Richard's chest tighten. Before Marcus could respond, his daughter Grace tugged at his hand, her voice a whisper, but filled with excitement. "Daddy, can we join her? Please." Her small voice carried more sincerity than any speech Richard had ever heard in his career. She didn't see a CEO's mansion or a lonely little girl in a wheelchair. She just saw another child, someone who needed a friend. Richard glanced at Ella. His daughter's face, which moments ago had been dim and tear-stained, now glowed with a spark of hope. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, looked at Grace as if she were seeing sunshine for the first time after a long storm. And in that instant, Richard realized how powerful this moment was. Marcus, noticing his daughter's eagerness, looked back at Richard. His voice was humble, careful, as though he didn't want to overstep boundaries. "If it's all right with you, sir," he said gently, "we'd love to celebrate with her." For a moment, Richard was silent. Inside, his thoughts battled. One part of him, the CEO, the man who had built walls around his family, hesitated. This was unusual. He had never invited employees into his private life, let alone into his most personal moments. What would people say if they knew? What would it look like? But another part of him, the father, the man who had just watched his daughter's tears, knew the answer. This wasn't about appearances. This wasn't about status, wealth, or rules. This was about Ella. And right now, she didn't need a grand party or expensive gifts. She needed exactly what was standing at the doorway: kindness, friendship, and warmth. He looked back at his daughter. Ella's hands gripped the edge of her chair, her body leaning forward ever so slightly. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but her eyes said it all. "Please, Daddy. Please say yes." That look undid him. Richard's lips curved into the faintest smile, his decision made. His voice, soft but steady, filled the room. "Of course," he said. "Please join us." The words seemed to light up the air instantly. Grace squealed softly and released her father's hand, running toward Ella without hesitation. Her little feet pattered across the marble floor as if she were running into the arms of a best friend she hadn't yet met. Ella's eyes widened in surprise, then softened into the brightest smile Richard had ever seen on her face. Marcus stepped forward carefully, bowing his head slightly in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Truly." His tone carried a sincerity that Richard rarely heard in the corporate world. There were no deals hidden behind his words, no hidden motives, just genuine appreciation. Richard gave him a nod, though inside he felt something shift. For years, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him: partnerships, contracts, investments. But Marcus wasn't asking for anything. He was simply offering presence, kindness, and joy for a little girl who needed it most. Richard's gaze moved back to Ella. She was already laughing softly as Grace pulled out a chair beside her. For the first time all evening, the heavy loneliness in her expression had lifted. And Richard thought to himself, sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. What happened next was nothing short of magical. Grace, full of childlike excitement, ran toward Ella without hesitation. She didn't pause to ask about her wheelchair, didn't tilt her head with pity the way so many others did. She simply saw another little girl, a potential friend, a birthday girl in need of company. In her small hands, she carried something simple yet priceless: a handmade bracelet. Colorful beads, uneven in size, were strung together with a thin elastic string. A single heart, but this bracelet, this was different. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was made with love. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "It's beautiful." Her voice carried more gratitude than words could express. Grace grinned wide, as if she had just given the greatest treasure in the world. And to Ella, she had. The two girls leaned closer to the cake, their heads almost touching. The candles flickered, their little flames reflecting in Ella's wide eyes. For once, she didn't feel like she was making a wish alone. "Ready?" Grace whispered. Ella nodded. Together, they took a deep breath and blew. The candles wavered, then went out, smoke curling upward in soft spirals. For a moment, there was silence. Then Marcus clapped his hands together. "Happy birthday to you," he sang, his deep voice filling the room with warmth. His voice carried the rhythm of joy, strong and confident. Grace joined in, her high-pitched giggle breaking into the tune. Even Richard, who hadn't sung in years, not even in the shower, found himself joining in. His deep voice cracked awkwardly, rusty from disuse, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't a CEO, wasn't the powerful Richard Hayes. He was simply a father, singing for his daughter. The grand dining hall, which only moments ago had felt cold and lifeless, now pulsed with warmth. The walls seemed to echo with laughter rather than silence. The golden chandelier above twinkled, as if it too was celebrating. When the song ended, Grace scooped a bit of icing from the cake with her finger and smeared it gently on Ella's nose. Ella gasped in surprise, then laughed, a sound so pure it startled Richard. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard her laugh like that, unguarded and full of joy. Not wanting to be outdone, Ella grabbed her own bit of icing and dabbed it onto Grace's cheek. The two girls squealed and burst into giggles, their laughter filling every empty corner of the room. Slices of cake were cut, though not neatly. Grace insisted on serving Ella first, handing her a plate with frosting slipping down the side. Ella accepted it like it was the finest dish in the world. They ate messily, giggling with every bite, leaving crumbs and smudges everywhere. For once, the expensive marble floor and silk tablecloth didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of joy. Richard stood back for a moment, watching in awe. His heart, so used to being weighed down by deals and deadlines, felt light. His daughter, his precious Ella, who had spent so many nights staring quietly out of her window, was glowing. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes sparkled, and her laughter rang louder than any boardroom applause he had ever received. And it all came down to one simple moment. One question. Can we join you? Richard swallowed hard, realizing the truth. The emptiness he had been trying to fill with money, luxury, and extravagance had been filled in seconds by kindness. He looked at Marcus, who stood a few feet away, smiling softly as he watched the girls. There was pride in his eyes, not for himself, but for the joy his daughter had brought into someone else's world. Richard nodded at him, a silent thank you. Marcus returned the gesture with a small bow of his head, as if to say it was nothing. But Richard knew better. It was everything. The night continued with the two girls playing simple games. They stacked macarons like blocks, tried bouncing spoons on their noses, and made silly faces until their stomachs hurt from laughing. Grace told Ella about her favorite songs, and Ella, for the first time, shared stories about her dolls and books. Time seemed to slip away. The mansion, usually filled with silence, now felt alive. Richard couldn't tear his eyes away. He had always seen Ella as fragile, someone who needed protecting. But tonight, he saw something different. She wasn't just his disabled daughter. She was a little girl with dreams, laughter, and so much love to give. She just needed someone willing to sit with her, to see her for who she truly was. As the evening wound down, Ella leaned back in her chair, her eyelids heavy, but her smile still glowing. She reached for Grace's hand and held it gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is the best birthday ever." Grace squeezed her hand back, her grin wide. "Best birthday for me too. You're my new best friend." Richard felt his throat tighten, his eyes burning. He had given his daughter countless gifts in her life, but none of them had brought her this much happiness. All it had taken was the presence of another child, a handmade bracelet, and laughter around a cake. And as he looked at his daughter's glowing face, he thought to himself, this is what birthdays are supposed to be. When the party finally began to wind down, the last crumbs of cake still scattered across the once pristine tablecloth, Grace wrapped her small arms around Ella. It wasn't the awkward hug of two children forced together by circumstance. It was genuine, tight, filled with the kind of affection only children can give without hesitation. "You're my new best friend," Grace whispered softly into Ella's ear. Ella's heart skipped. Her smile was brighter than the candles had been earlier, her eyes shimmering like stars. For the very first time in her life, she didn't feel like the CEO's disabled daughter, sitting on the outside looking in. She didn't feel like the girl whispered about by classmates or pitted by their parents. She felt like what she had always longed to be, a little girl who was seen, chosen, and loved as a friend. The words settled deep in her soul, warm and comforting. She hugged Grace back, her tiny hands gripping tightly as though afraid to let go. She had wished earlier, in the silence of that cold dining hall, for just one person who would sit with her. And here she was. Her wish had come true. Richard stood a few steps away, his chest heavy with emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He had seen his daughter smile before, of course, but not like this. Not the kind of smile that lit up her entire being, not the kind of smile that made her forget every moment of loneliness she had endured. He cleared his throat, his usually commanding voice now unsteady. Turning toward Marcus, he spoke with sincerity that carried the weight of a father's gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to me," Richard said, his voice thick. "Thank you for giving my daughter the best gift she could ever have." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. He gave a small nod, unable to trust his voice any longer. The two girls continued playing for a little while longer, drawing silly faces on napkins, humming songs, and whispering secrets, as though they had known each other for years. Eventually, though, Marcus gently touched Grace's shoulder. It was time to go. "Already?" Ella asked softly, disappointment flickering in her voice. Grace looked at her new friend and grinned. "Don't worry, we'll come back. Best friends never say goodbye. We say see you soon." Ella's smile returned, wide and full of hope. Richard watched as Marcus took Grace's hand, leading her toward the door. Before stepping out, Marcus paused and turned back. Their eyes met, and for a moment, no words were needed. Respect passed between them, two fathers from very different worlds, united by the love they held for their daughters. When the door finally closed and the house grew quiet again, Richard turned to look at Ella. She was still staring at the bracelet on her wrist, running her fingers over the beads as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. And in truth it was. That little bracelet, made by a child's hands, carried something no diamond, no gold, no luxury brand could ever hold. It carried love. Richard slowly walked over to his daughter and knelt beside her chair. "Did you have a good birthday, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Ella looked up at him, her smile glowing. "The best one ever." Her answer was soft, but it shook Richard to his core. He realized that tonight had been a turning point, not just for Ella, but for himself. For years, he had believed that providing comfort, wealth, and security was enough. He had convinced himself that he was being a good father because his daughter lacked for nothing material. But tonight, he had seen the truth. What Ella needed most was not wealth, it was connection. Not gifts, it was friendship. Not a father who provided from afar, but a father who was truly present. That night, long after Ella had gone to bed with the bracelet still on her wrist and a smile still on her face, Richard sat alone in the quiet dining hall. The decorations had begun to wilt, the balloons slowly sinking, the cake half-eaten. But the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint glow of the chandelier. His mind replayed the moment, the spark in Ella's eyes when Grace called her a best friend, the laughter that had filled the room, the warmth that had replaced emptiness. And in that moment, Richard realized something money could never buy: kindness, connection, and friendship. He promised himself he would never again let Ella feel forgotten. He vowed to fill her life not just with luxury, but with people who cared. He would invite Grace and Marcus back often. He would open his doors to kindness, no matter where it came from. Because one small act of compassion had changed everything. From that day forward, birthdays at the Hayes Mansion were never lonely. The laughter of children filled the halls. The dining table was crowded with plates and giggles, and Ella's smile never faded. And all of it began with one simple question, one act of courage, one moment of kindness, spoken at the doorway of a lonely party. Can we join you? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us share more stories like this. Comment below what part moved you the most. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, subscribe and join our family so you never miss the next story. Until then, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next video.